Hi everyone, welcome to Workshop 3 of the STEM Buddies Summer Research Program. My name is Leslie. I'm one of your co-operations directors alongside Garvit. And today we're going to be focusing on two really important components of the research paper, the introduction and the conclusion. These two sections essentially bookend your paper. Your introduction tells the readers what you're trying to accomplish, what your study matters, and ultimately all the background required to understand your proposal. Your conclusion brings everything back together and explains what your research ultimately means in the broader scheme of things. Since this year's theme is mental health, hopefully you'll be able to connect these concepts to the topics for your proposals you'll be developing yourselves. Before we get started, here's a reminder of the schedule that you should be following. You've already completed our orientation and as well as the methodology workshop, where we discuss things like statistics and experimental design. Today, we're going to be working on introductions and conclusions. After this, you'll cover abstracts, scientific writing and structuring your paper, peer review and feedback, and finally, presentation practice. So we're now moving from designing your research towards actually writing your research with this workshop, which is really exciting. There are two main learning objectives today. First, we're going to learn about introductions, what its purpose is, and how you can effectively develop one. Then we'll do the same for the conclusion. For both sections, I don't want you to think of them as paragraphs you just have to fill with information. Each section has a specific job, and there's actually a logical sequence you can follow when writing them, which we will go through today. By the end of today, you should have a framework that you can apply directly to your research proposal. We'll start with the introduction. Think about it about picking up a research paper on a topic in mental health you've never studied before. Before you can understand the methods or the results, you really need some context for the topic. What problem are these researchers interested in? Why does this problem matter? What do we already know? And what are the researchers actually trying to find out about this topic? These are essentially the questions your introduction needs to answer. So there are three major objectives of an introduction. First, it should introduce your topic and explain why it's important. You need to give the reader a reason to care about the problem you're investigating. Second, it should communicate the approach being used to investigate the topic. And third, it should provide background information necessary to understand your research. Here's an example. On the screen, this paper investigates SAME as an adjunctive therapy for major depressive disorder. If you look at the excerpts on the right, you can actually see these objectives in a published paper. It establishes why depression treatment remains an important problem, provides scientific background, and then explains the study the researchers conducted. We're going to break down how they accomplish that in the next few slides. So one way to make writing your introduction much easier is to think of it as a pipeline with 4 steps. First, introduce the topic. Second, describe the background. Third, establish the research problem. Finally, specify your objective. Notice that this generally moves from broad to specific, so like a funnel. For example, if your proposal is about social media and adolescent anxiety, you wouldn't immediately start with your exact hypothesis. You might begin with adolescent mental health more broadly, discuss what we know about social media and anxiety currently, identify what's missing from that current literature, and then state what your proposed study will be investigating. So remember, start broad and then slowly narrow your focus to your specific research question. The first step is to simply introduce your topic and explain why it's important. In our example, the topic is the impact of adjunctive SAME on major depressive disorder. The authors establish its importance by explaining that although antidepressants have become safer and more tolerable, their overall effectiveness remains largely unchanged. That immediately creates a reason for this study. We have a problem that hasn't been fully solved. Additionally, powerful introductions use a hook. In scientific writing, hooks are good ways to get the reader engaged in the paper. It can be a captivating fact, question, or observation. Observation that establishes your topic, why your topic deserves attention. For your mental health research proposals, this could be an observation about the prevalence or impact of the issue you're studying. Just remember that unlike a creative writing hook that you may have done in English classes, a scientific hook still needs to be accurate and evidence-based based on what you have read in the current literature. Next, describe the background. Once you've introduced the topic, you need to give readers enough background to understand the problem. How you do this can differ depending on the type of research paper. An argumentative paper, which you can see on the left, makes a particular case and gives the reader a general overview of the topic. For example, social media has use has increased rapidly. It provides opportunities for connection, but there are concerns about its relationship with self-esteem among young people. An empirical paper, on the other hand, focuses more heavily on existing evidence. What have previous studies found? What do we currently know? And most importantly, what don't we know? The example on the slide says that studies have found a correlation between Snapchat use and lower self-esteem among teenagers, but few have examined whether the relationship differs by age. Notice how the final sentence starts moving us towards a research gap. For your proposals, your background shouldn't just be a collection of random facts about mental health. Every piece of information should help the reader understand why your particular research question exists. Be intentional with every sentence in your introduction, especially considering the word limit of your research proposals. Here's what this looks like in our same example. This is an empirical paper, so the authors use previous research to establish what is known and what is unknown. The section highlighted in green gives us the known information. The authors discuss existing approaches to improving antidepressant response, introducing SAME, explain some of its relevant biological mechanisms, and describe why it could potentially be useful for depression. Now, look at the bottom right-hand side highlighted in red. The authors point out that many previous SAME studies assessed it as monotherapy, while relatively few investigated its usefulness as an adjunctive therapy. That's the unknown this paper is addressing. And that transition from here's what we know to here's what we don't know is one of the most important parts to understand and execute when writing an introduction. Step three is essentially the research problem, and there are is establishing the research problem, and there are essentially three parts to this. First is the problem. In this example, antidepressant efficacy has not improved substantially, despite other advances. Second is the background, which gives us information about existing antidepressant approaches and SAME as a potential therapy. And third is how the study addresses the problem. Here, the researchers replicate previous findings in a larger sample to further evaluate SAME's effectiveness. So the logical chain goes from here's a problem, here's what we currently know about it, here's what still remains uncertain, and here's how our research helps address that uncertainty. Try applying these exact steps to your own mental health research proposal. If you can't clearly explain each of these pieces, that's usually a sign that your research question needs further development and you may have to go back to the drawing board with your team. The final step is specifying your objective. Essentially, why are you conducting this research and what exactly are you trying to accomplish? As the slide shows, this can look different depending on your research design. A meta-analysis on the left-hand side of the screen combines evidence from multiple studies. Its objective might be to resolve inconsistencies across the literature and reach a stronger overall conclusion. A single study paper analyzes data from one particular research project. Its objective may instead be to understand and directly address a gap in specific scientific knowledge. For your research proposals, your objective should be specific enough that someone can read it and immediately understand what your proposed study is designed to investigate. You can use either approaches displayed on the slide for your research proposals. Here we can see that difference using SAME as an example once again. On the left, the meta-analysis combines multiple studies because there were inconsistencies in the existing evidence. By looking across studies, the researchers aim to reach a more comprehensive conclusion about SAME's therapeutic relevance. On the right side, the single study analyzes one data set to investigate SAME's therapeutic credibility and biomarkers associated with response. They're approaching the issue differently, but both are ultimately trying to address a gap in scientific knowledge. And notice the point at the bottom of the slide. The objective usually appears near the end of the introduction. Hence, it is the last step of the introduction pipeline. That's why the order of our pipeline matters. By the time you state, therefore the study aims to, the readers should already understand exactly why this study needs to exist. Now we're going to move on to the other end of the paper, the conclusion. If the introduction answers why should we conduct this research, the conclusion is much closer to so what? What's the reason for this paper? What did the research actually tell us? What does it mean and why does it matter? While you likely won't be writing the conclusion until you finish the other parts of your paper, it's important to note that the conclusion and introduction are essentially mirrors of each other. Just like the introduction, we can use a simple pipeline for the conclusion. First, restate the research question or problem. Second, interpret the results. And third, discuss the implications. One important difference is that the conclusion isn't where you suddenly introduce an entirely new argument or evidence. You're bringing together what you've already established and helping your reader understand its significance. These are all three objectives in a little more detail. These are the three objectives in them a little more detail. First, remind the reader of the research question. Second, interpret your results rather than simply repeating them. And third, discuss the implications and limitations. On the right-hand side, you can see a systematic review about household recycling behavior. This is an effective conclusion as it fully addresses each piece of the conclusion. You can see how the same basic structure applies whether you're studying recycling behavior, depressive treatments, or any specific question in your specific topic. The first step is to remind the reader about the research problem. In this example, the authors restate their objective of assessing how strong and reliable the existing evidence is around factors influencing household recycling behavior. But notice that restating doesn't mean copy and pasting your introduction. You want to return to the same central problem using slightly different language now that your reader has already gone through the entire paper. We recommend avoiding phrases like in conclusion or to conclude. Your reader already knows that they're reading the conclusion, so instead you can begin directly with the research problem or overall finding. Next, interpret your results. There are really two things happening here. First, briefly summarize key findings, arguments, or insights. Second, and this is arguably more important, tell the reader what those findings mean. The example found that very few of the reviewed studies provided strong enough evidence to support conclusions about the causal factors influencing recycling behavior. The authors then interpret that finding by explaining that the literature therefore lacks robust causal evidence. The same principle applies to mental health research. Imagine your hypothetical study found an association between greater social media use and anxiety symptoms. Simply repeating that result isn't enough for your conclusion. You need to discuss what that association means in relation to your research question and the broader literature. Importantly, don't claim more than your design allows. In other words, if you found one thing from your research proposal, do not expand that and keep stating new findings in your conclusion. Your conclusion shouldn't suddenly claim that one variable causes the other or anything that your findings did not directly address. That is falsifying research and not good science. The final step asks the biggest question: why are these findings important? There are three useful things to consider in this section. First is implications. What does this research contribute, and why should anyone care? Second is limitations. What prevented the study from answering the question perfectly? In the example on recycling, some limitations included limited time, limited resources, and limited access to relevant populations. A limitation doesn't automatically make research bad. Recognizing limitations helps us understand how confidently we can interpret the findings and what research still needs to be done. Later on in academia, you will realize limitations are an important part of an academic paper, and very few papers now can be published without having a limitation section. So keep that in mind. This is also particularly important in mental health research because these topics are often complex and multifaceted. Your one research proposal will not answer every question there is in this topic you choose, and identify what else needs to be done in this field so future researchers can build upon the research you have done and discover more findings. Ultimately, your conclusion shouldn't end at here's what we found. It should get to here's why this matters, here's what we still don't know, and here's where future research can go next. So that brings us to the end of today's workshop. If there's one thing I want you to remember, it's that your introduction and conclusion should connect to each other. Your introduction moves from a broader topic towards a specific research question and objective, where you really start broad and then narrow your focus. Your conclusion, on the other hand, is the other way around, where you start with your research question, so quite narrow, then explain what your findings mean, and then broaden to the implications and future directions of your research. As you're developing your mental health proposals, keep asking yourself two questions. Why does this research need to be done? And if we did it, why would the answers matter? If you have any questions about today's workshop or about applying the structure to your own proposals, feel free to reach out to us through the Discord channel. And that is the end of this webinar. So good luck with your research proposals, and we're looking forward to seeing them.